Welcome to the One-Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. Omni. One chapter, the whole book. This actually ended up being a pretty extensive and difficult chapter for me. There was a lot going on in it, and some things didn't really make sense, and it took me a while to figure them out. Unfortunately, this is going to be a pretty long video because of that. Chapter overview. This book covers a space of approximately 200 years, according to the chronology on LDS.org, and was written by 5 different men during that time. 4 of the accounts are really short, anywhere from 1 to 5 verses, and then the last account is much longer, containing at least 20 verses, if not more. By way of reminder, the genealogy of the Book of Mormon starts with Lehi, and it goes to, yes, Nephi, but Jacob is also Lehi's son. So from father to son, it's Lehi to Jacob, to Enos, to Jerem, to Omni, or perhaps it's pronounced Omni, I don't know, to Ammoron, who then passes him to his brother Chemish. Why Omni didn't pass him directly to Chemish is not said. Then it goes father to son again, from Chemish to Abinadom to Amalekite. The last account is the longest and actually contains a narrative from before the time that the last man was even born. In the narrative, we are introduced to the land of Zarahemla and King Mosiah, who is said to have been a fugitive from the land of Nephi sometime earlier. I must say that I find it rather humorous, perhaps it was some sort of joke on Joseph Smith's part, that the first book in the Book of Mormon that has more than one author has, here it's actually 5 men who contribute to it, is the book called Omni, which of course is the Latin abbreviation for all, such as omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, or omniscient, meaning all-knowing. And here we have a book that has all authors, or that is at least 5, and meaning all. I just found it humorous. Verses 1 through 3 are Omni saying that he was commanded by his father to write on the plates to preserve their genealogy, which he does, and says that he fought the Lamanites, then gave the plates to his son Ammoron. Verse 3 gives a timestamp, actually 2 timestamps, one right after the other, and in this way it makes no sense. It says, "And it came to pass that 276 years had passed away, and we had many seasons of peace, and we had many seasons of serious war and bloodshed. Yea, and in fine, 282 years had passed away." But why? Why does it have 276 years followed immediately by 282 years, with nothing in between the 2 times to mark out why there is even any difference given? Why not just say 282 years passed away and that was it? It'd be one thing if it said 276 years passed away until the birth of my son Ammoron, and now it is 282 years, and the Lord has shown me that I must soon pass from this earth, so I can sign the records to him so that he can write on them when he is of sufficient age. But nothing like that is even remotely hinted at, so it just seems weird and sloppy. I don't know if Joseph Smith just made a mistake and then continued as if he hadn't, or if he was, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps deliberately, picking up on the years 1776 and 1782, the latter being when the preliminary articles ending the Revolutionary War, many seasons of serious war and bloodshed, were signed, though only formalized in 1783 to actually end the Revolutionary War. And then Joseph Smith would have converted those from 1776 to 276, and from 1782, the practical end of the war, to 282. Perhaps. It's an intriguing theory. Verses 4 through 8 are Ammoron's records, including that now 320 years had passed, and the more wicked Nephites had been destroyed according to God's word. Then he passes the plates to his brother Chemish rather than to his son for some reason. I would assume it's because he has no son, but that is not said. In verse 8, we're introduced to the name Chemish, which is an odd name, but it reminded me of something in the Bible, and after much searching, I finally found it. In Numbers 21:29, it speaks of the people of Chemosh, Chemosh, whereas Chemish in the Book of Mormon is Chemish, only one letter different. I mention this because some Mormons think it's a mark of authenticity for the Book of Mormon to have names that sound like Hebrew names, or that could be said to be Hebrew names, to mean something in Hebrew. But since the Book of Mormon borrows so heavily from the Bible, it doesn't really make sense that that would be a mark of authenticity, because it could just be plagiarism, borrowing, perhaps intended to be identical borrowing, and a mistake was made in the spelling. Perhaps Joseph Smith just simply changed a word or a letter here and there, such as changing Chemosh to Chemish. It may have been intentional, but then again, it may have just been accidental. If Joseph Smith came across the name Chemosh in the Bible when he was just looking for names to add to the Book of Mormon, he may have pronounced it as Chemosh and not said it clearly, Chemosh, just a kind of a vague, generic sound, Chemish. And the scribe would have perhaps misunderstood it and written with an I, as if it was Chemish. Moving on to verse 9. Now I, Chemish, write what few things I write in the same book with my brother. For behold, I saw the last which he wrote, that he wrote it with his own hand. And he wrote it in the day that he delivered them unto me. And after this manner we keep the records. For it is according to the commandments of our fathers. And I make an end. This sounds like it's saying that every time the plates change hands, that on the day that they change hands, the person who currently has them writes an epilogue or some sort of statement like that, then hands them over to the next person in line. For the sake of chronology, we would say that this single verse likely spans some period of decades, probably even 20 to 40 years, and perhaps even more. We're just not told. Verses 10 through 11 is the record of Chemish's son Abinadom, which again likely but not certainly would span some 40 to 50 years in these two verses, based on the average length of time between the time that a father receives the plates and then hands them down to his son, as far as we can determine from what little chronological information is given here in the Book of Mormon. It says that the Nephites and Lamanites continually fought, and that there was no revelation nor prophecy in that time. Verse 11 also says in part, the record of this people is engraven upon plates which is had by the kings. Again, remember, earlier in the Book of Mormon, God said that the promised land was not to be ruled by kings, and that he would destroy those who set up a king. The Book of Mormon can't even agree with itself. Verses 12 all the way through the end of the book are written by Abinadab's son Amaleki. Again, see how similar this is to the biblical prophet Malachi? It's like Joseph Smith found the name in the Bible, added an to the beginning of it, then spoke it to his scribe, who wrote it down however he wanted. Because Malachi in English, Malachi, and Malachi in the Book of Mormon, Amaleki. Instead of giving an account of himself, Malachi introduces us out of nowhere to King Messiah, who reigns over the land of Zarahemla. This was one of the things that made this part of the Book of Mormon kind of difficult for me, because he just pops up out of the blue with no introduction or anything like that. And I was confused for a while as to who Messiah was and where Zarahemla was and why we're being introduced to them and all of that. We are not giving any sort of Messiah's backstory, except that he had left the land of Nephi at some point, apparently because of the wickedness of the Nephites, since he receives revelation from God that he is to leave and to take all who will be obedient and go with him. So it sounds like the disobedient stay in the land of Nephi. But the problem is that God had promised that the Nephites would keep the land only insofar as they were good and obedient. But here we have the wicked, disobedient ones keeping the land, while the good and obedient ones leave. Again, the Book of Mormon can't even agree with itself. It also disagrees with the Bible because, of course, the Bible records that the land of Israel is the land for Israel, and they always come back to that land rather than being moved somewhere else. Further in verse 5, during the lifetime of Ammoron, the more wicked part of the Nephites were destroyed. And in verse 7, while it is said that God brought judgment against the Nephites for their sins, he preserved the righteous so that they didn't perish. So again and again in this short book, we're told that the good people were preserved and the bad people were killed or otherwise punished. Yet now we're told that the good people left the land of Nephi. As far as timing goes, we're not told how old Messiah is at the time Amaleki writes, except that in verse 23, Amaleki was born at some point during Messiah's reign and lived to see his son Benjamin reign. Apparently, Messiah and Ammoron were contemporaries. In verse 13, we're told that Mosiah and his companions went some great distance into the wilderness until they came to the land which is called the land of Zarahemla, which was already populated. Verse 14 introduces us to these residents of Zarahemla, who are the first people that the Nephites interact with in the Americas other than the Lamanites. These people rejoice because the people of Mosiah have the brass plates, though we're not told how on earth he could have gotten them, since they would presumably have been passed from King Nephi to his sons, so on and so forth down through the years, and they would have been considered royal treasures. Then verse 15 tells us that the people of Zarahemla left Jerusalem when King Zedekiah was carried away captive into Babylon. This would put them as leaving around 587 to 586 BC. But this doesn't work with the Bible at all, because the residents of Jerusalem were either killed or carried away captive when King Zedekiah was. In verse 17, we discover that their language had become corrupted, and Mosiah nor the people of Mosiah could understand them. So, just how did Mosiah know who they were and where they came from if he didn't understand them? At best, the Mormon would claim that the verses are written out of order and are not meant to convey strict chronology, but are just explaining up front who the people are and where they came from, and Mosiah would only find out about it later. That is a reasonable explanation, but it's just kind of sloppy. In verse 18, we're told that Mosiah caused that they should be taught in his language. Okay, so let me get this straight. In verse 17, we're told that they were exceeding numerous, but it's not the relatively small band of Nephites led by Mosiah who are made to learn the new language. Oh no, it's the exceedingly numerous Zarahemlites who are forced to do so. That makes perfect sense. Also in this verse it says, Zarahemla gave a genealogy of his fathers, which makes it sound like Zarahemla is a person rather than a city or a land. Verse 19 says that Mosiah became king over the united people of Zarahemla and those who came with Mosiah. First of all, remember that the Book of Mormon has repeatedly condemned those who would be kings in this land. Secondly, why would Mosiah be made their king when he was an outsider? And we're never given any reason for it. Just said that it happens. In the previous verses, we're told that the people of Zarahemla had rejected the idea that they had a creator, with the implication being that they did so because they had no records with them and so had forgotten their history. But remember, they left Jerusalem at the same time that Lehi and his family did. Both of them, both the people of Lehi, who became the Lamanites and the Nephites, as well as the people of Zarahemla, supposedly receiving revelation from God saying that they needed to get out of the land of Jerusalem. So apparently God considered the people of Zarahemla righteous enough to receive revelation to get out of Jerusalem, but not righteous enough to send them prophets to keep them believing in him, I guess. And even though we're not given any indication that the people of Zarahemla ever repented of their atheism, they seem just fine with being ruled over by righteous Mosiah, but perhaps without ever becoming believers in God. Verses 20 through 22 tell us about a person named Coriantumr, who was discovered by the people of Zarahemla and who lived with them for the space of 9 moons. I think it's odd for Joseph Smith to have used the term moons instead of months, and think that this is an obvious allusion to the Indian way of keeping track of time, to strengthen the idea in his readers' minds that these people were indeed the ancestors of the American Indians. Anyway, continuing on with the narrative, apparently this Coriantumr lived with the people but had a rock on which he had engraved his history. And because they had different languages, the people of Zarahemla had no clue what it said, so Mosiah translated it the same way that Joseph Smith would later translate the Book of Mormon, not by a rock and a hat, but by the gift and power of God. He supposedly is a descendant of a people group that left the Middle East at the time of the Tower of Babel, and lived and died in the land northward. It appears he's the last of his tribe, and what happened after the end of the 9 months that he lived with the people of Zarahemla? Did he just leave? Did he die? We can only speculate. Now, one problem with Coriantumr's existence is that we were told earlier that God would keep this promised land from being known by people outside of it, and yet here we have people that were not Lamanites or Nephites that were not people of Lehi knowing about it. We can make an exception for these people of Zarahemla because they were also descended from Israel, but this Coriantumr he was a descendant from people who lived way back then, so not an Israelite at all. So that's a contradiction with the Book of Mormon within itself. As previously mentioned, verse 23 says that Amaleki was born in the days of King Mosiah and lived to see King Benjamin's days. But we're not told how Amaleki knows anything of King Mosiah. I suppose it's plausible that Amaleki's father Abinadom was one of the righteous people who left the land of Nephi with Mosiah, but why wouldn't Abinadom have even mentioned that? Just a huge thing, a huge part of his life, leaving the land of Nephi and going somewhere else, and he doesn't even give a hint of it? Just doesn't make sense. Verse 24 continues by saying that Amaleki saw serious war and much bloodshed between the Nephites and the Lamanites, with the Nephites here apparently the numerous people of Zarahemla that were in no way related to Nephi, able to drive them out of the land of Zarahemla. Amaleki continues his chronology in verse 25 by saying that since he has no offspring, he's going to give the place to King Benjamin, because he knows that he'll take good care of him. In verses 25 and 26, Amaleki slips into sermonizing and says in part, "For there is nothing which is good, save it comes from the Lord, and that which is evil cometh from the devil." This is an important verse in understanding Mormonism, because it actually serves as at least partial basis for their claims that good feelings equals the Holy Spirit. Of course, it completely goes against the Bible, which says that God sends both good and evil as he wishes, such as Isaiah 45:7, "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." Also remember when Saul was king, before David became king, that there was an evil spirit that came upon King Saul sometimes, and David would have to play the harp to drive the spirit away. It's said to come from God. Now remember, the plates of brass specifically are said to contain Isaiah and also the history of the Old Testament, and Nephi has quoted extensively from Isaiah, so there's no good reason for this contradiction. To complete the account, Omni ends with Amaleki reporting in verses 27 through 30 that a certain number, presumably a group of the Nephites that came with Mosiah, tried to go back to the land of Nephi to try to regain the land of their inheritance, but all but 50 were killed in the wilderness. So this must have been quite a big number, if we're told that 50 is a small remnant of the ones that originally left. They return to Zarahemla and try again with, quote, "a considerable number," including Amaleki's brother, and nothing more was heard of them. And that is the end of Omni.